Chapter 27 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 27, in which I looked for one scene and saw another. Dear girls, you who are 16, almost 17, if ever you have been, or ever you should be, in just the position that I was that evening, standing there with my cousin Abby in the moonlight, and listening to that softly whispered sentence, let me commend to you, at least in this particular, my conduct. I did not faint. I did not cry out. I did not push my cousin from me as I would a serpent, in heroic novel style. I stood very quietly, and received her sweet kiss at the end of the sentence, and returned it. And the thing of which I was dimly conscious was a sense of relief that I had not told her about that last sentence at once, but had waited until circumstances made it unnecessary ever to tell it. I do not remember how I congratulated her, or indeed whether I had brains enough to do it at all. I was very much amazed and a good deal stunned. Of course I had never dreamed of such a thing. I remember being very glad that the gas was turned out, and only the soft pale moon lighted the room. I know I carried a very heavy heart to bed that night, and I remember that after Abby was quietly sleeping I shed some bitter tears, but at last I, too, fell asleep, and thus ends the record of the wonderful day in which I felt my destiny coming to me on such swift wings. Have you learned anything about the special matter that I had to consult you about? Mr. Sayles asked me, as he came forward on my entrance to the parlor the next evening, and held out both hands in greeting. I think I have, I answered, promptly and gaily. But, Mr. Sayles, doesn't the consultation come rather late? He laughed merrily. Oh, no, indeed. There are a great many things to settle yet, and an obdurate young woman to persuade into anything like reasonable behavior. Julia, were you surprised? I suppose my cheeks glowed. I don't see how they could well help it. I know they felt very red. But the room was warm, and my cheeks are naturally rosy, so, after all, I am not certain that any one but myself knew about them. I know I answered steadily. Yes, I was very much. I don't know when I have been more astonished. Why, were you? He said, looking amazed. I didn't think you would be. I thought you would have seen through it long ago. I have given you credit for more clear-sightedness than you possess, haven't I? He had indeed. But, he continued eagerly, this was not this special thing after all. I knew Abby would tell you about it, but I was eager to claim my cousinship, and say to you how glad I am that... And then followed the usual words on such occasions, very kind and very complimentary, about considering him in the light of a cousin not only, but a brother, he should be so glad to... I interrupted him saucily. I had a brother of my very own, I told him, the nicest brother in the world, and I shouldn't accept any platonic brotherhood. Then followed a great deal of pleasant nonsense, in which Abby joined merrily, and it was interspersed with some earnest words, but I distinctly remember that the whole talk only served to make me feel sick and miserable, and more utterly desolate than I had felt in a long time. A few days thereafter, as we obeyed the summons to tea, I became conscious soon after I entered the dining room of a strange presence there, a tall, dark, singularly handsome man, and there immediately rushed over me a remembrance of what I had heard about the singular fascination that Mr. Alec Tyndall's face possessed. So before Mrs. Tyndall had said, "My brother, Mr. Tyndall, Miss Ried," I knew that it was he. He talked exceedingly well, being one of those talkers whose words flow on smoothly and quietly, without apparently the slightest effort on their part, and without seeming to be aware that they are in the least degree remarkable. When we gathered around the table, there was one thing that surprised me. It was the instant quiet bending of his head and the shading of his eyes with his hand. This before there had been given him any indication that in his brother's family they had learned to recognize a Heavenly Father's hand in supply of their daily needs. Mr. Sayles had misjudged our Mr. Tyndall's strength, or rather his weakness. His voice was never quieter nor firmer than when he asked a simple blessing on the food. Meantime, I speculated over Mr. Alec Tyndall's conduct. Had he learned the new order of things, and was this his graceful concession to the ways of the household, or was it his habit, since there was a strange gentleman added to the family, to take all things for granted until proved to the contrary? I inclined to the latter opinion, as that would seem in keeping with his inimitable courtesy, and he did not by word or look express surprise at his brother's new position. During the remainder of the evening part of our household at least were on the qui vive. "I wouldn't be in his shoes," said Mr. Sayles, with an expressive shrug of his shoulders, "for an interest in his bank account." "Why?" I asked curiously. "What do you imagine Mrs. Tyndall will do or can do? She hasn't them in her power in any way." "Oh, no, but she has it in her power to make them an immense deal of botheration; and she'll exercise her power too, or I'm mistaken; and I should hate it so. I do hate scenes and trouble of all sorts." I remember I wondered whether Abbie would not have been a little, just a little, better pleased with him if he had been a shade more self-sustained and manly. If she would, she didn't express it by look or act, but simply questioned in her quiet way, "Don't you imagine he is equal to the occasion?" And Mr. Sayles laughed, and gave her an admiring glance as if she had said a remarkable thing, and answered, "Upon my word, I think he is, if any mortal ever was." So on that conviction we rested, waiting for further developments. Matters were very quiet the next day. Mr. Tyndall was absent the most of the day, and Frank was not in the shop. We, Abbie and I, wondered if Mrs. Tyndall knew anything about it yet, and concluded that she did not; and we discovered nothing until the next morning. Mr. Sayles had come in to get Mr. Alec Tyndall to accompany him on a drive, and found us at breakfast. He drew up his chair, took a cup of coffee with us, and stopped to prayers. The doctor was present, and led the service that morning. As we were about to separate, Mrs. Tyndall said, in her simplest, most matter-of-course tone, "By the way, Jerome, you must come in to tea. We are going to have a quiet little family party at tea time, and a few friends in the evening. Alec is going to bring Frank down to tea. You don't mind these ladies knowing that Frank is one of the family, do you, Alec?" "Not in the least," Mr. Alec Tyndall said, with a gracious bow to the ladies; and Mr. Sayles, ere he answered, glanced over at me with such a curious look of delighted astonishment that I disgraced myself by laughing. I did not expect to meet Frank at the shop, but she was there, and had been apparently for some time, and was working very rapidly. She looked precisely the Frank that she had always been as regarded dress and manner, but there was a radiant look in her eyes that I could account for, though I knew the others could not. In the course of the morning I stood near her. She and I had grown very near to each other in heart during the last few weeks, yet I did not like to speak first of her personal affairs, though I felt very curious, and also somewhat anxious to have her understand that I knew of the arrangements. She broke the silence, however. "You belong to that family party this afternoon, of course?" she said, in a low tone, with a vivid blush and a bright smile. "Yes, I do," I answered eagerly. "Oh, Frank, why didn't you tell me about it?" "I told nobody," she answered, decidedly. "He had been gone a long, long time, and California is very far away, and the world is full of changes. But," with that brilliant smile of hers, "it doesn't matter who knows it now." We were hurried in the shop. There was little time for talk. Mr. Jerome Sayles had managed the matter of the afternoon holiday for Frank and myself. The other girls could not imagine with what argument, but of course I surmised. At noon Frank piled up her boxes snugly in a corner. "There," she said. "Ruthie, don't let any one touch my work. I mean to be here bright and early to-morrow morning to finish it. Are you ready, Julia?" And with a parting bow and smile to the girls, and a gleeful reply that she was going to seek her fortune in answer to their curious questions as to what was going to become of her that afternoon, we left the shop together. "They are good girls, every one of them," she said earnestly, as we went down the familiar street. "I shall never forget how good and kind they have been to me. When I have a house of my own, the first thing I shall do will be to invite them all to spend the day with me. I should have liked Mrs. Tyndall better if she had asked every one of them to meet me to-night; but that would have been too much to expect of flesh and blood." "And after all," I said somewhat hesitatingly, "they are not quite your company. I mean you cannot enjoy their society exactly." "No," she answered promptly. "We are not congenial perhaps; that is, I have received a good education and enjoy it, and they have not, and don't care for it. But they are nice, good girls for all that, and I enjoy their society quite as well as I do Mrs. Shoddy's, for instance, who lives in a palace on Regent Street, and uses worse grammar than any of them do. You understand that I think it is not because I work in a shop that I am not fitted to shine in any circle, nor does my working there make me fit. That is merely an accident, force of circumstances, or choice of work, and has nothing whatever to do with position. That's my platform." And then we parted, to meet again 3 hours later in Mrs. Tyndall's elegant parlors. Abbie and I were in the room, so also was Mr. Sayles, or Jerome, as we all called him now, when Mr. Aleck Tyndall and Miss Hooper arrived. I think I have spoken before of Frank's severe plainness of dress. She had never varied it in the least. I had never seen her in other than the simplest of material and make, and with her hair stretched plainly back in a net. As she came forward now, I could not restrain a start of astonishment, and I saw Jerome's eyes dance. She evidently looked natural to him. She wore a soft, silky, sheeny dress of silvery hue, entirely new, exquisitely made as to trimmings and fit, and it became her as nothing ever had before, and her hair fell loose about her neck in round, puffy, natural curls. It seemed to me that Mrs. Tyndall must have thought the two singularly well mated. She advanced to meet them, held out her hand to Frank as simply and cordially as though she had entertained her but yesterday, kissed her in a familiar sisterly way, and said: "You're tired, aren't you, with your long walk? Aleck, you wretch, why didn't you take the carriage? That is a pretty way to take care of her. You think because you are a Hercules in that matter that everyone is. He'll walk you to death, Frank. Take this chair, you get a pleasanter view than in the one you have chosen." And this was the famous meeting, the wonderful scene, that we had planned about, and gossiped over, and been nervous in view of for days. "Ahem!" said Jerome, by way of attracting my attention. But I persistently talked to Frank, and wouldn't look. I knew I should laugh if I did; and he finally contented himself with a walk to the back parlor, where he leaned over the piano and whistled Yankee Doodle in a very undertone. We had an early, quiet tea, but with one surprise. As we settled into that hush which precedes the lifting up of thankful hearts, Mr. Tyndall said in a voice in which there was a great throb of joy, "Aleck, will you ask a blessing?" And the infidel bowed his head, and the strange voice uttered a few reverent, grateful words. Frank's face expressed joy, but not surprise. She had been told of the wonderful change. But Mr. Sayles' face expressed unbounded astonishment. He walked with me back to the parlor. He had lost all desire to laugh. His tone was earnest and solemn. "The Lord can take care of his own, it seems, without your and my fretting about it," he said, emphatically. "But I declare to you I never was more amazed in my life. I could as soon have expected that bit of marble to ask a blessing. But then, when one thinks of it, he might well have been equally surprised at hearing me. The way in which we have all been led is wonderful, perfectly wonderful. How could any one know of the facts concerning just this small company without recognizing at once a power above and beyond all human strength?" We had a wonderfully pleasant evening. We had a very choice selection of guests, prominent among whom were Lycius Simons and Florence Hervey. Dr. and Mrs. Mulford were the latest to arrive. I had to spend nearly half my time in watching Frank. She glided into this new position, or rather back into her old position, so smoothly and gracefully, and there was about her a certain quiet dignity, a half nameless deference to those around her, that was new and exceedingly becoming. "What are they going to do?" I asked Mr. Sayles in the course of the evening. "I don't know, I'm sure. Tyndall wants to be married at once, I knew he would; and Frank won't, I knew she wouldn't. Women are so confoundedly silly and obstinate, begging your pardon, of course. But they must spend 10,000 years in sewing if anybody is waiting to marry them. They have both wills made of iron. I suppose they will fight it out until one of them yields." Later in the evening we grew merrier, and some wise brain proposed impromptu charades and tableaux, a suggestion which Mrs. Tyndall caught at eagerly, and Mr. Sayles and I entered into very heartily. We really had some very good ones. I remember them distinctly. Presently Mr. Sayles came over to me with a puzzled look. "They are going to have a marriage scene, and Aleck and Frank are to be the actors. It isn't in the least like either of them. I wonder that they will enter into it." "Whose getting up is it?" I asked. "Mrs. Tyndall's. She seems to be in high glee over that and everything else. What a woman she is!" "Who will they get to officiate?" "Don't know. It's a wonder they didn't ask me. I expected it. I always used to be selected for matters of that sort. I wouldn't do it, though. I don't like farces of that kind. The thing has grown too sacred." And he glanced toward Abbie. "Hark!" as the folding doors began to slide. "They are coming. Who will they have for a clergyman? I'll be hanged if it isn't Dr. Mulford himself!" And then the hum of voices instantly hushed, for Dr. Mulford commenced the marriage service, the veritable words, without change or omission, pronounced in solemn tone even to the words, "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder," and then the prayer. And then we stood petrified, until Mr. and Mrs. Tyndall pressed forward, smiling and composed, to greet the bride. It was a bride, then? Yes, indeed, no farce about it. One of the iron wills had broken. Strong as words of man and words of prayer could make it, had the service been, and Frank Hooper was Mrs. Aleck Tyndall. I can't describe the commotion that followed. Everybody talked and wondered, and oh'd, and why'd, and laughed, and ate cake, and congratulated the bride, only Mr. Sayles. "It was rather cruel, Frank," he said, when opportunity offered, "to desert and take me so overwhelmingly by surprise at the last moment, when I have been your faithful ally for so long." "I hadn't an idea of it," she explained, eagerly. "I mean I hadn't the least intention of doing anything so wild. It seemed perfectly absurd." "How do you happen to be a married woman, then?" "I'm sure I don't know," she answered, meekly, and her husband smiled and said, he did, and it was perfectly satisfactory, and led her away. "It wasn't a very iron will, after all," I said to Jerome. "Yes, it was," he answered, emphatically. "Only he has got all of hers and all his mixed up together, somehow." "It was nice," announced this same gentleman, as every guest having departed, Mrs. Tyndall and I lingered a moment in the back parlor to talk over the strange circumstances with Abbie and Jerome. "It was nice. I liked it. No fuss or getting ready a century beforehand, no gossiping as to when it will be. I wish—" He stopped abruptly and seemed confused. Mrs. Tyndall laughed mischievously. "We'll go, Julia," she said, gaily. "We are unmistakably too large an audience for the discussion of that subject." Shall I confess what I did? I went to my room, and to bed, and when safe there in the darkness, I cried a little. I wasn't exactly unhappy, only miserably lonely, and also somewhat sentimental. But finally I dried my eyes and went to sleep. Chapter 27.